Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. I am honored to have Chairman and CEO of the LBJ Foundation, Mark Updgrove, with us today to talk about President Lyndon B. Johnson. And I have yet to go to the LBJ library, but my husband has been there and told me how amazing it is. And I'm also excited, Mark, to have you on because presidential libraries are so important in how we understand civic learning. So thank you so much for being on our podcast today.
Delighted to be with you, Liz.
So my first question, what made President Johnson such an effective political figure?
Boy, that's a complicated question because he's a complicated man. But yeah, I'd say it's four things in no particular order. Number one, the power to influence. He had this singular ability to get people to see his way on things. It was legendarily known in Washington as the Johnson treatment. And you can see photographs of this and you can hear LBJ applying that brand of influence in the telephone tapes that are the crown jewel of the LBJ Presidential Library Archive. I think he also had this uncanny understanding of the legislative process. He knew how it worked, and I think he outworked his colleagues, which explains a lot, explains why he was able to outmaneuver them. It also explains why he was able to work his way up the ranks as quickly as he did, gaining favor of Franklin Roosevelt when he was a congressman, becoming a senator in 1948, working his way up the ranks to minority whip, minority leader, and then perhaps the most powerful majority leader in the history of the United States Senate. And then, of course, vice president, president. And the last thing, though, is his passion for progressive reform. And you see that in particular in his presidency. I know we'll talk about the Great Society, but LBJ saw the flaws in America. He understood how difficult some people had it in this country, and he wanted to use his administration, not so much to finish the presidency of John F. Kennedy, which he took over after the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, but to finish the New Deal that he had seen developing when he was a congressman and Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House. So those are among the things that I think made him very effective.
So you bring up the assassination. He takes over for President Kennedy in 1963. Why then is the election in 1964 such a pivotal moment in American politics?
Well, he takes over for Kennedy, and I think the balance of that term, the Kennedy's term, which LBJ finished out after succeeding the presidency, is vitally important because LBJ advances the cause of civil rights. John F. Kennedy had proposed the Civil Rights Act in the summer of 1963, but he didn't put a lot of legislative might. He didn't put the weight of the presidency behind it. It was politically risky for Kennedy. He shied away from that, but he did elevate civil rights to a moral cause and introduced this legislation that was really going nowhere. And LBJ knew he could use the martyrdom of Kennedy to get the Civil Rights Act through. His advisors tell him he shouldn't do it. He should wait until he gets the presidency in his own right before pushing it. And he famously says, "What the hell's the presidency for?" He gets it through. But the election of 1964 becomes important for Lyndon Johnson because he wanted to be president in his own right, not an accidental president. And he does so in 1964 with what is still the largest popular electoral mandate in history. Almost 62% of the American people vote for Lyndon Johnson versus his Republican challenger, Barry Goldwater, a very conservative and at the time controversial figure. But I think it's important to America that Lyndon Johnson wins that election because, as I mentioned, there was so much that progressive, so much of LBJ's progressive agenda that he could lay out with his own presidency. And he doesn't hesitate to do so when he gets the presidency in his own right and knows 1965 is going to be an incredibly important year for him because he understands the ephemeral nature of political capital. He says when a president is first elected, he's a giraffe. 6 months later, he's a worm. He knows that this political capital is going to fade. So he wants to get as much of his very progressive agenda through as long as he has that power. And he does so in 1965, principally with remarkable effectiveness.
So you're talking, we talk about how Lyndon Johnson wanted kind of his own presidency, and Kennedy had the New Frontier, and Johnson has the Great Society. What made the Great Society so significant?
I think it's sheer audacity. He liked a lot of what Kennedy was doing, but he said, he thought, scale it up. Let's make it bigger. So LBJ, he also has, again, this uncanny ability to not only understand the legislative process, but to get people on his side of the issue. So with that, and also has this tidal wave of support. As I mentioned, the largest electoral mandate in history. He has these outsized majorities in both the House and the Senate, but it should be noted, has to run over members of his own party in the South in order to get his very progressive civil rights agenda through. So in 1965 alone, you have LBJ putting in place the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Head Start, Vista, Job Corps, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Highway Beautification Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Immigration Act, the most sweeping immigration reform in the history of our country, and the Voting Rights Act. And I probably missed one or two. Oh, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act. I mean, there is nothing in American history that even comes close to rivaling that, with the possible exception of 1933 and FDR's first year in the New Deal, particularly those first 100 days, when there's this alphabet soup of legislation helped to get Americans through the ravages of the Great Depression. But the difference is that a lot of those laws went away when the Great Depression subsided. With Lyndon Johnson, again, until this, I think, very rogue administration started eradicating these laws, this was the foundation for modern America. This is an astounding leap forward in so many areas. And we're seeing today that all of those things, almost without exception, are under siege in the current administration.
As you were listing that, I'm just, in 4 years, it's so much to get through and to really, change a lot of things for Americans. So
actually, I would note, Liz, that is just 1965. In the balance of the administration, you have, in 1966, 67, 68, you have the Fair Housing Act, you have the Public Broadcasting Act, you have mandatory safety belts, you have other environmental legislation going through. You have all these different, the public broadcasting, I think I mentioned, freedom of information, all that stuff happens in the balance of the administration. So that's just 1 year. It's an astounding legislative record.
That is incredible. So then in 1968, he decides not to run again. Can you tell us a little bit about what stands out about that address?
Well, I think the one thing that we haven't mentioned, we mentioned the progressive reform and the domestic policy of this administration. We haven't mentioned the LBJ legacy albatross, which is the war in Vietnam, which we now know was a quagmire. We lost 58,000 American troops to the war in Vietnam. 42,000 were lost under Lyndon Johnson's tenure as commander-in-chief as he escalated the war, which was, again, we now know ill-fated. That was less clear at the time. But it was enormously controversial. We had a draft in place at the time. It was not an all-volunteer army. So there were a lot of young men who were enlisted in the military to fight in Vietnam who didn't believe in the cause. So that made it enormously controversial. And LBJ sees an increasingly divided electorate. And I think that's one of the reasons that he opted to step aside in 1968 in a very famous address he made on March 31st, in which he said, I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party as another term as your president. Those are his words. And I think most people believe that he didn't think that he would get elected again because of the controversy in Vietnam. He believed he could. I believe he probably could have as well, but he knew that he would have further torn the country apart. I think the other thing that people may not realize, Liz, is that he had a very weak heart. He almost died of a heart attack during his years in the Senate when he was minority leader in 1955 at the age of 47. He had a nearly fatal heart attack. And he was very conscious of not only his own weak heart, but of a history of heart disease in his family. His father died at 62 of a heart ailment. So did his grandfather at the same age, 62. As it happens, LBJ died of a heart attack at 64. So he was prescient. So all things being equal, had he been reelected, he would have died 2 years after serving his next term as president. He died on January 22nd, 1969. So I think those were the reasons that he opted to step aside. But it shows his, I think, humility and his foresight to do so.
So when we talk about, presidents and presidential libraries, why do presidential libraries and things like these conversations matter for civic education and for public understanding?
Well, I think for two reasons. Number one, these are repositories of the record. So scholars like you and members of the general public, you don't have to be a scholar to go into the reading rooms of these presidential libraries and access the record, which belongs to the American people. At least it did before this administration's Department of Justice decided that the Presidential Records Act should not stand, something that's been in place since 1981 and was signed into law in 1978. So that's one thing. I mean, this is the place of study for these presidents, and you can access these records. That transparency should be one of the hallmarks of our singular democratic republic. I think the other thing is their access points for people, young people in particular, to understand not only the history of a president, but our history of the presidency in general. And their public squares where we can have a platform not only to talk about that president and his legacy, but to talk about our history at large and to talk in general about the issues that continue to be relevant to Americans today and into our future.
And my last question is for our younger listeners. If you were to pick something, and this might be an impossible question, what is your favorite thing about LBJ? Or what is something that maybe people don't know about him?
I think that there's so much that people don't know about LBJ. He's largely underappreciated in American history. He's a really fascinating guy, and I think that litany of laws that I enumerated is just an astounding reflection of what he was able to do during a very crucial time in our history. But I think that it ultimately, I think the biggest part of his legacy, this might answer your question, Liz, is civil rights. And if your listeners are to do anything, I would strongly recommend them accessing the telephone conversations that I referred to earlier. LBJ surreptitiously recorded many of his telephone conversations during his course in the White House. We don't know why. We just know that these tape recordings existed. and he taped them without the people on the other end of the line knowing he was doing so. I think it was so he had a record of what was transpiring in a conversation, particularly as it related to legislation. So if you and I were making a negotiation and I taped the conversation, I would know what you said. So I could go back to you and say, hold on, Liz, I thought you guaranteed that I would get this if I gave you this, right? And I think that's probably why he did it. But if you listen to those conversations, you not only understand LBJ's presidency better, including all the things I mentioned, the massive domestic reform and crucial decisions around the Vietnam War, but you also understand the presidency better and the kinds of challenges a president has to reconcile with on any given day of his presidency. If he's always wrestling with the most major issues in our country, because if those issues were resolved at another stage in the process, they wouldn't reach a president's desk, right? So you can get a sense not only of him, but of the presidency writ large.
And listeners, I will make sure to link the LBJ tapes. They are readily available online. And I appreciate that you say that, because I think that often, students especially think like, oh, LBJ, that was so long ago, but you can hear his voice. And I think that was one of my favorite things when I was studying him, was just the way he talked.
Yeah.
It was so commanding, but there was also sometimes just this little spark of humor that made him a person, that made him, he's not just a president, he is a person.
He was a great storyteller too. And I think that came from his rural upbringing in the hill country of Texas, where he didn't have radio or television. People stood around and they told stories. And so I think that was a big part of how he got things done. He would tell a story that related to what he was trying to get from you. But I think, what you hear in those tapes, Liz, and what I really admire from President Johnson is he humanizes the reform that he's trying to get through. For instance, when he's talking about why the elementary and secondary education is so important, he talks about the fact that it will benefit schools for people of color, particularly in the South, where you still had segregated schools in the South, despite the Civil Rights Act being passed in the first full year of his presidency. But he talks about that Black worker at a gas station who has to understand how to read and write in order to write out receipts and work the cash register. All those things, he's humanizing all this stuff. And he's thinking about the person for whom that legislation will be especially beneficial.
That is amazing. Mark, thank you so much. I mean, I could talk about LBJ all day long, because I think he's such an interesting person. And now, that much legislation in 1 year is almost unheard of now. But what an incredible accomplishment. So thank you so much for your expertise and your time. It is so greatly appreciated.
Great to be with you, Liz. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.